Welcome to the fighting spirit of old Japan. The inheritor of the now famous Melbruno archives for this very valuable and rare footage of some of Japan's greatest masters. The first art we will describe is Iaido. Iaido is the art of quickly and skillfully drawing the sword. Here, a practitioner of Iaido sits in seiza, the Japanese formal sitting position. He bows to the weapon, then inserts the weapon into his belt or obi to secure it. He then performs a ceremonial kata, the first kata known as mai, squeezing his knees together, stepping out, drawing and cutting quickly, rising and then cutting down on an opponent's head. Then he sheathes the sword called noto. Then stepping back, he draws, blocks, and cuts once again. Now another view. Cutting, stepping forward and cutting again. Shaking off the blood, chiburi, and then noto, putting the sword away. Blocking and cutting once again. Now, Iaido, formerly known as Iai Jitsu, was an art of quick draw practiced by the samurai warrior. Modern Iaido is a reflection of this art and has been carried into modern times by styles such as Kotori Shinto-ryu, Hasagawa-ryu, Yagyu, and Mukai. Here we see a drip chiburi, shaking the blood off and inserting the sword noto, putting it away. The art of Iaido is now supervised by the Zen Nihon Iaido Renmei. It consists mainly of the practice of kata in a meditative state. Here we see yet another form of chiburi, or wiping the blood off the blade after a cut is made. Now, yet another formal sitting position and another kata is performed. Marote, in other words, supporting the blade with the back of the hand, stomping the ground, fumikomi, shaking the blood off and putting away the sword once again. In fact, all of Iaido's kata start off with a cutting motion, shaking off of the blood, and then securing the blade or noto. You'll observe this in each kata, a stab, a cut in another direction, shaking off the blood, and then noto once again. Now we come on Police Jo, or the art of Jo-Jitsu. Now here we see the famous Melbruno, a judo practitioner from the 1950s, attacking a Jo-Jitsu practitioner, and he's demonstrating how he would defend against a Western-style boxer and also the use of a knife. Here he defeats a knife-wielding assailant. Again, striking his lead hand and countering with the Jo. A crushing blow to the head stops Melbruno dead in his tracks. Here he strikes his hand, crippling his left hand and preventing him from attacking further. Now, a Western-style boxer, the same technique, crippling his left hand with a blow from the stick. A thrust to the stomach. Stopping again, just stopping him dead in his tracks against a would-be wrestler. Now, a defense from a person wielding a similar weapon, thrusting at him with either a bayonet or a stick. Striking to the wrist and countering. Now, the art of using the long stick originated in Japan over 400 years ago. It was invented by a samurai swordsman known as Muso Gonosuke. He is famous for defeating the legendary Miyamoto Musashi. However, he was originally defeated by Musashi when they both used Boken in a match. But after performing and perfecting his techniques repeatedly, he had a second match with Musashi. Now, the Jo in modern times has been adapted by the police, and it is known as Keibo Soho. The police techniques actually evolved from 12 basic blows developed by Muso Gonosuke into 70 advanced techniques. Here you can see the way in which the stick is grasped and used from alternative sides, striking to various vital points. Here a senior practitioner shows how to use the Jo effectively against a sword. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that the Jo was used oftentimes in a situation where non-lethal results were required. Here you can see the intricacies of the movement of the Jo and see its relationship to the katana, or the samurai sword. Knocking down, actually uchi otoshi, knocking down the opponent's sword and then countering. Now a tying up movement, knocking his sword away and countering. Here we have the practitioner slipping the blow of the sword and then countering with the Jo. Next, driving the opponent away, pinning his sword to the ground and countering with a strike to the body, actually. This is a shutting down motion, getting inside the opponent's range so he can no longer use his weapon. And this one, a strike to the wrist and the rib simultaneously from underneath. Next, the Jo practitioner assumes a Hasunogomai. The spinning motion is a distraction technique. Again, coming from underneath and pinning the opponent's sword to the ground. All ways of using the Jo against a swordsman. Striking to the wrist and thrusting, avoiding the opponent's strike, and then another crushing blow to the head. Here we have a innocent-looking enough kamae. The opponent appears defenseless while he has the Jo above his head, and then you can see how quickly he can turn it to his advantage. Yes, turns it to his own advantage. Now the police Jo, or Keibo Soho, uses techniques for crowd control. Here we see two officers prepared to defend against an unruly mob, demonstrating some of their techniques to the right, to the left. And now forming a barrier, an impenetrable barrier, so that the crowd cannot pass through. Now also, notice the defensive kamae, or posture. Here, an overhead kiryu rosh, as used in swordsmanship, is used to drive a crowd back. The coordinated movements, almost like the coordinated movements of armies, coordinated troop movements, help drive the crowd away. And this one is to deprive the opponent of being able to grab the end of the stick. Now, this one is a gyakute mochi. The same idea, using gyakute mochi, in other words, a reverse grip with a lead hand. Here we see a side posture, almost like waki no kamae in swordsmanship, striking over the top. Again, all designed to deprive the opponent, or in this case, would-be assailant, from being able to grab the end of the stick. Now here we have the same concept being executed, but yet with another technique, a thrusting technique, driving it into the solar plexus deeply. Now thrusting from above, the same concept, but get to another vital point. Yes, here you see them advancing, driving the crowd back. This one, nukiski, a sliding thrust to the forward section and then again to the rear. Now to the side, so that the four corners are all covered. Note the formality of the 1950s police officers. The next martial art to discuss is Kendo, the way of the sword. Now, Kendo originated from Kenjutsu, an earlier ancestral form, which dates back to almost 2,000 years. Kenjutsu was practiced actively from the 9th century onward. And in fact, during the Tokugawa period, from about 1600 to 1867, there were over 200 practicing Kenjutsu schools in Japan, and competition in swordsmanship was merciless. However, what's happened is it evolved into the modern art sport of Kendo, wherein we're using protective equipment or armor known as dogu. Here the sensei dons the tenagui, or the towel used to protect the head. And also he is now putting on the men. Again, a bit of armor derived from the actual samurai helmet. This was derived by the Itoryu Kenjutsu faction. Notice the himo, which are used to tighten up and hold the men in place. The tenagui is not only used for keeping the sweat out of the eyes, but also to avoid a crushing blow. Here we see a practice called kirikaishi. Kirikaishi, a repetition of strokes. Stepping forward, practicing those strokes, and then running through and striking men to the head. The idea of Kendo is to run through and strike the opponent. Strike the opponent to the head. Now, the two Kendo practitioners, or Kendoka, engage in open sparring known as keiko. There's a do strike to the body, a strike to the head or men. Here we have another sparring match, striking do. Actually, this is a form of keiko wherein one practitioner merely functions as a target. He's not countering. You'll notice he doesn't counter himself. He's allowing actually, in most cases, the student to do the attacking, striking men again. And now you see a counter. Now here we have an actual match. And you can imagine in the days of old when this was performed with real swords, the bloody melee that would have ensued. However, with the shinai, or the development of the bamboo practice sword, which evolved at around the 18th century, introduced a measure of safety to the game. Right, you see them vying for an opening. Actually, the competitor on the right was awarded a pound, a full point for that strike. Wow, there's another fantastic blow, although no point was awarded. Ah, yet another, a perfect men strike to the head, which, by the way, is the principal technique in kendo. The object is to catch your opponent completely unawares, strike him in the men to the head thusly. Now they assume the Sankyo position. Putting their swords away, they retire and then bow to finish the match. Now, the idea of Kenjutsu, the earlier ancestral form of kendo, was a way of using real swords on the battlefield. Swords would be drawn, and then warring armies would face one another, and again the bloody melee in Japan's history would begin. However, modern kendo has adapted the idea of using the live blade from Kenjutsu into its kata, or formal exercises. Now, there are 10 of these formal exercises, or kata, in modern kendo. They are, in fact, all derived from actual Kenjutsu techniques, or kata. Now we have practitioners facing one another, finishing up a Kenjutsu kata. In fact, the oldest known, still existing Kenjutsu style practiced in Japan is known as the Katori Shinto-ryu. This particular school uses many different types of weapon as well as the sword, or the katana. There's much ritual involved with the practice of the sword. Many ideas of etiquette are all part of the samurai's behavior pattern, if you will. There was once a practice known as saya ate. If you were to bang another person's saya, allowing your scabbard to crash into his, it was in effect a challenge. It was a breach of etiquette, which often ended in the death of one of the samurai. The modern kata of kendo also use 3 kata with what is known as the kodachi. The kodachi is a short sword, similar to the wakizashi, although it is known as the kodachi in the kendo kata. And this brings into play the tactics and the methods of using this short sword in close combat. Now, oftentimes inside a castle or another samurai's house, the swords were checked at the door, so that the long sword, the odachi, as it's also referred to, was not available to a samurai to defend himself. So all he was allowed to carry was the wakizashi, or the short sword. And of course, the idea was to get inside the opponent's weapon. If the opponent had a long sword, to get inside his weapon, trap his long sword, thus depriving him of the advantage of the range of the long sword, and allowing one with a short sword to be on top, so to speak. Now, the whole idea of the sword, of course, embraces the entire fighting spirit of old Japan. In fact, the sword is a symbol of the power of the emperor, the courage of the samurai, and also the chief weapon used to fight among warring samurai factions for the control of the rice field. Now, the chief idea, or way the samurai sword or katana is used, is in a slicing motion. In fact, the curvature of the blade is what actually uses the mechanics of the blade, if you will, to produce a slicing effect. This, in fact, will cut off or hack off limbs in a mere fraction of a second. A rather formidable weapon in anyone's hands. a 3-foot razor blade. And many tactics evolved in evasion of another person's blow, with no actual blocking action, but just cutting down, literally slicing a man in half. Again, avoidance of an opponent's blow by just merely taisabake, or stepping out of the way with no actual block, was a high level of swordsmanship. Why, if one doesn't have time to take time to block, his technique or his counter is twice as fast. A very stylized movement in the use of the blade. Here we see a defense against ski, the thrust, and then pressing back to dominate the opponent, pushing his will down, both physically and mentally. Again, the formality, the ritual of the Japanese martial arts is reflected in these kendo kata. Here we have waki no kamae, 2 swords crashing down from the Itoryu Kenjutsu system. Suriage blocking, resulting in slicing off the opponent's head. In modern kendo, there is emphasis on striking to the head rather than cutting the neck, as in Kenjutsu. A minor difference. Again, avoiding the opponent's strike and cutting to the head. Itoku no itokumae is the Japanese representation for the amount of appropriate distance between 2 swords, or 2 swordsmen. When that distance is achieved, that is when one must attack, or leave. Now, the next martial art, or weapon art, we have to show you is the short stick, also known as tanbo. Now, the short stick sort of evolved in the 17th and 18th century environment and was associated with the art of jiu-jitsu. Now, jiu-jitsu originally was on the battlefield, but then later became sort of a police-style method of controlling unruly samurai in the nightclub district. Here we have a defense against a thrust, a strike to the wrist, followed by kote gaishi, a wrist twist, flipping the opponent to his stomach where he can no longer counterattack. This brings us to the end of this vintage archival footage. I hope you've enjoyed it. This is Damien Chambers saying so long for now and until next time.